सबों को जय मसीह की। मेरा नाम है डेनिस और मैं आज रिएक्ट करने वाला हूँ कुछ बिब्लिकल चीज़ों के बारे में जो एक एक्सप्लोरर हैं उन्होंने लाजरस की टूम मतलब लाजरस की कवर को डिस्कवर किया हुआ है और उसको देखेंगे हम और परमेश्वर की महिमा के लिए एक चीज़ और इकट्ठा करेंगे लोगों को बताने के लिए कि जो बाइबल में जो वर्ड्स हैं जो स्टोरीज है जो जिस लोगों के बारे में बताया गया है वो एग्जैक्ट द सेम है जैसी बाइबल में बताई जा रही है और उसके एविडेंस भी मौजूद हैं। तो ज़्यादा आपका टाइम वेस्ट ना करते हुए हम सीधे चलेंगे वीडियो की तरफ।
I'm in Al-Azariah, which preserves the ancient biblical name of Lazarus, and this is where the tomb of Lazarus is located.
Is there archaeological evidence that the traditional tomb of Lazarus is authentic?
अच्छा ये है उनकी कब्र के सामने से लेके जा रहे हैं क्या? ऊपर से खुली थी क्या कब्र?
The most famous tomb on earth is where Jesus rose from the dead, just outside of the AD 1st century city of Jerusalem. However, just to the east of Jerusalem is the Mount of Olives. And situated on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives was the town of Bethany. And further to the east, on the outskirts of Bethany, was another famous tomb, because of the event that took place there almost 2,000 years ago. John chapter 11 says, "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany. After Lazarus died, Jesus came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. 'Take away the stone,' he said. 'But Lord,' said Martha, the sister of the dead man, 'by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days.' They took away the stone. 'Lazarus, come out.' The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, 'Take off the grave clothes and let him go.'" This view looks west, with Bethany in the foreground and Jerusalem in the background. This cluster of commemorative buildings marks the location of the tomb of Lazarus. Excavations began here in 1949. Just to the west is the location of the ancient town of Bethany. Excavations began here in 1951. West of Bethany is the top of the Mount of Olives, and on the other side the Dome of the Rock is seen on the ancient Temple Mount, where at the time of Jesus and Lazarus, the temple stood. So this is the excavation report of the archaeologist Sylvester Soller, which took place in Bethany between 1949 and 1953. Reading through this excavation report, I was disappointed because Soller doesn't really discuss the tomb itself. Isn't the point the tomb? But then over time I started realizing, this is the excavations at Bethany. And one thing that Soller did not excavate was the tomb. He couldn't excavate the tomb because it was never buried.
जो बुक वो जो देख रहा था उसमें उसने बोला कि यार ये तो है ही नहीं। मतलब जो लोग थोड़ा सा इंग्लिश कम समझते हैं उनको मैं उनके लिए एक्सप्लेन कर रहा हूँ कि वो एक बुक देख रहा था और बुक के द्वारा वो उस जगह तक रिसर्च कर रहा था तो उसको पता चला कि यार इसमें तो कब्र ही नहीं है। तो उसको बाद में रियलाइज़ हुआ कि अरे वो कब्र कैसे हो सकती है जब यीशु मसीह ने लाजरस को ऑलरेडी जिंदा कर दिया है तो उसकी कब्र कैसे हो सकती है वहाँ पर। और यही चीज़ मैं आपको बताना चाह रहा था कि जब लोगों को पता चला कि यीशु मसीह लाजरस के पास जा रहे हैं उनके घर जा रहे हैं तो लोग इकट्ठा हो गए, यहूदी और बाकी जितने भी हैं जो नहीं मानते थे यीशु मसीह में, इकट्ठा हो गए और उन्होंने बोला कि चलो हम साथ में चल के देखेंगे, अगर यीशु मसीह ने कुछ भी गड़बड़ किया या उनकी व्यवस्था के अनुसार नहीं हुआ या फिर कुछ प्रॉब्लमेटिक निकला तो हम इन पे पथराव करके मार देंगे। तो ये बात चेलों को पता थी, ये बात चेलों तक पहुंच गई थी और चेले थोड़ा सा घबरा रहे थे। पर यीशु मसीह चले और जैसे ही यीशु मसीह ने लाजरस को ज़िंदा किया तो लोगों के मन में बात आ गई और बहुत सारे लोग विश्वासी बन गए। वहाँ बहुत सारे लोगों ने विश्वासी बना और यीशु मसीह का ये इसलिए बहुत बड़ा चमत्कार काउंट होता है कि उन्होंने लाजरस को ज़िंदा किया, क्योंकि उन्होंने बोला कि दवाइयों के कारण हुआ पहला, फिर बोला कि हमारे यहाँ 3 दिन तक हो जाता है, मगर 4 दिन का मरा लाजरस। लोगों के पास कोई सवाल ही नहीं था, वो लोग क्या पूछते, कैसे हुआ, अपने आप को भी सही साबित करने के लिए क्या बोलते यीशु मसीह को। तो बहुत सारी चीज़ें थी इस एक इवेंट में कि बहुत सारे लोग यीशु मसीह के पीछे हो लिए और यीशु मसीह का ये बहुत बड़ा चमत्कार है। आगे वीडियो में देखते हैं।
Because it was visited over the course of 2,000 years, and the event that took place there was never forgotten. And therefore you can't find something that's not lost, and you can't excavate something that was never buried.
From Soller's drawings, the position of the tomb of Lazarus is shown in yellow, and the walls attached to it, cut out of the bedrock, are shown in brown. Today, these lie beneath a roofed building.
So here I am at the tomb of Lazarus. I'm standing in an ancient cave. The Bible specifically says that the tomb of Lazarus was in a cave. You can see right here, a line right here, as well as a line right here. This was the original entrance into the cave that was blocked up later in history.
Okay, so this place has been venerated for almost 2,000 years, so as expected, it's been modified many times. You see these later walls that have been built here, an arched roof in this chamber. But if you look in these patches where these later walls are not preserved, then you see the walls of the original cave back behind them.
So in about AD 330, the early church historian Eusebius visits the tomb of Lazarus. He writes, Lazarus' place is still shown there. And this is evidence that shows that the tradition, the belief that this was Lazarus' tomb is very old. It goes back far before Eusebius, because he's amazed that by his time, 300 years after the event, it's still being pointed out there, it's still being shown. Well, we can say the same thing today, 1,700 years after Eusebius visited the site. We can say to this day, it's still being shown to people as the tomb of Lazarus. Why was it never forgotten? It says in verse 45 that many Jews who had seen what Jesus did believed in him. This makes sense then for why the tomb was never forgotten. Because
यही मैं बोल रहा था कि बहुत सारे लोग विश्वासी हो गए थे और उन्होंने भी डिस्क्राइब किया ये चीज़, थोड़ा बनता है।
event itself caused many Jews to believe, many locals to believe in Jesus, and therefore Christians were represented in the local population from the time of the event until today, and they did not forget the amazing miracle that happened there and where it happened. Another thing that gives credibility to the traditional tomb of Lazarus being the authentic tomb is its context. It is just to the east of the village that Soller as Bethany, because the description of the location of Bethany in the Bible is a match for the ruins that Soller excavated, being on the backside of the Mount of Olives, being on the road that comes up from Jericho to Jerusalem, and being located less than 2 miles from Jerusalem.
John 11:18 says, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Bethania, wrote Eusebius, is a village at the second milestone from Eli, that is Jerusalem, on the flank of the Mount of Olives, where Christ raised Lazarus. Seen here is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Less than 2 miles to the east is ancient Bethany. This is where Soller excavated. A little further east is the tomb of Lazarus.
Okay, so this is the ancient route that's coming up here from Jericho on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem on the western side of the Mount of Olives. You can't go this route today because there's the modern wall, and you see this burned gate here is blocking off the Jerusalem side of the Mount of Olives from the Bethany side of the Mount of Olives. This location fits perfectly the village that was found in the excavations in the early 1900s, just to the west of the tomb of Lazarus.
So Bethany itself was excavated thoroughly, and the houses were found, and the occupation of the site was found. It was occupied from the Persian period up through the early Roman period, the time of Jesus and Lazarus, the time of the event.
Okay, so I don't know who's been digging in this area, but you can see some of the stones that have been uncovered. There's a lot of first century pottery. You can see the edge of a wall here, probably a house wall.
लोग खुदाई बहुत कर देते हैं ना चीजों की.
And so this is the area that is just west of the tomb of Lazarus. This is where they were excavating in the early 1950s, where they found the town of Bethany itself, where Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha were from. And now it's covered with modern buildings, so you can't see much of the area, but there's this patch in between the buildings, and I can see some of the archaeological evidence dating back to AD 1st century, the time of Jesus and Lazarus.
The tomb of Lazarus is located under this roof. This is the entrance from the street level. Solar could not excavate directly east of the tomb, because during the Islamic period, this mosque was built with its minaret. Where Solar excavated was east of this mosque. Before this modern church was built over the site, the apse of an earlier church was visible here. This is where Solar began his excavations.
Okay.
Looking down on these buildings, we see the location of the tomb of Lazarus. The apse to the east was excavated, and the church it belonged to uncovered. Below it was a second church, and below it was another church. This was the deepest, and therefore the oldest church, dating to the AD 300s. Later, a fourth church from the Crusader period was discovered that was built right over the tomb, and then a fifth church was built over the archaeology, which is still in use today.
So behind me here is the stack of 5 churches, all commemorating the event that happened almost 2,000 years ago here when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead.
Solar called the oldest church the first church, then the second church above it. Then came the third church, the fourth church, and the fifth church.
So we can see the different archaeological layers of the floor here preserved intact.
So here is the floor level from the third church. This is the floor level underneath it, preserved from the second church. And then just over here, we have a preserved layer from the first church.
Several patches of the mosaics of the first church can still be seen at the site today. For example, this one.
This is a mosaic from the first church, the oldest church.
And this one.
पहले तो बहुत नीचे होगा.
Here we have a series of pillars, and capitals, bases that are preserved from the ancient churches that stood in this place.
In the Islamic period, the mosque was built over what previously was the courtyard of the earlier churches.
बंद है.
Okay, so I named this mosque.
So this is the courtyard that separated the church from the tomb of Lazarus. And I'm going to get out of here before we get serious trouble.
In the Crusader church, the original entrance to the cave was blocked up, and the tomb was entered from the street level by stairs.
Strong for this being the authentic tomb of Lazarus. You have the town of Bethany that was found and excavated, which is occupied at the time of the event. You have other tombs in the vicinity that date to the same time period, the early Roman period, as the tomb itself that's being commemorated. You have this stack of archaeological layers that are commemorating this as the tomb of Lazarus. You have the historical event recorded in the Bible that fits the description and location of the site, and you have the extra biblical mentions that also help us understand that all of this together represents strong evidence that this is the tomb where Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. I was taking a shot of the entrance from street level of the tomb, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this is a boring shot. There's nothing happening here. And then I heard something, and I looked through my camera lens, and I saw these palm branches coming up the street, and behind them was this crowd, and I realized this is a funeral. And so my shot all of a sudden became very inspired, because literally a dead body passed between my camera. Just everything's pretty much the same. The problem is the same. The need that people have is the same. The need that we have is a solution to death. The biblical solution to death is not that we don't die. The Bible says that the grave is the destiny of everyone. Rather, the solution to death in the Bible is resurrection. And more specifically, it is Jesus, because the one who was raised from the dead is also the one who raises the dead. And so the reason that people kept visiting this tomb over the course of 2,000 years is because it represented to them hope. They were connecting what had happened to Lazarus in the past to what was going to happen to them in the future. A good example of this is when Jesus is approaching the tomb of Lazarus. Martha, Lazarus' sister, comes out to meet him, and to comfort her, he says to her, "Your brother will rise again." And she answers Jesus by saying, I know that he will rise at the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. So when I think about it for myself personally, Jesus is so much greater than me that sometimes he's hard for me to relate to. He's God in flesh. How do I relate to that? He's sinless. How do I relate to that? But Lazarus I can relate to, because he's a man just like me. And so I know that unless Jesus comes back first, I know that I, like Lazarus, will die. I, like Lazarus, will enter the grave. But I can enter the grave like Lazarus did.
बहुत बड़ी बात कर रहा है, बहुत प्यारा मैसेज दिया।
Lazarus needed Jesus to call him out of the grave. So in the future, I need Jesus to call me out of my grave. To me, is like a monument of archaeological evidence that demonstrates hope. So if you enjoy this content, then you might want to consider ordering a copy of my book, Where God Came Down. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can order that. It's been a #1 bestseller in archaeology. And also, I would appreciate it if you like this video. You can subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
बहुत ही डिटेल्ड वीडियो बनाया था उन्होंने, और बहुत सारी चीज़ें जो उन्होंने बताई हैं वो एक ही चीज़ पे ले जाती है, यीशु मसीह के चमत्कार के ऊपर। और यही हमारा मकसद है, यही मेरे चैनल का मकसद है कि अलग अलग चीज़ों से हम यीशु मसीह को, उनकी बातों को बता सकें। मतलब कुल मिला के यही है कि हमें सबको पता है कि बाइबल एक ऐसी किताब है जिसका प्रूफ है कि ये स्पॉट यहाँ है, ये यहाँ पर हुआ था, ये इवेंट्स ऐसे हुए थे। तो कोई भी बाइबल को किसी भी रूप में गलत नहीं साबित कर सकता, और इसके प्रूफ भी है। तो बस यही है। और अगर आपको मेरा वीडियो अच्छा लगा हो तो प्लीज़ लाइक कीजिएगा, और आपको अगर ऐसे ही वीडियो के कंटेंट्स और चाहिए कि मैं बहुत सारी चीज़ें ढूंढ के लेके आऊँगा आप तक और आपको दिखाऊँगा और हम इस पर बातें करेंगे, तो मेरे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन बेल एंड एवरीथिंग जो भी आपका मन है वो कर सकते हैं। पर मेरा मकसद बस यही है कि यीशु मसीह के बारे में मैं कैसे बता सकूं, लोगों को बात कर सकूं, क्योंकि मैं अपने अंदर इतना केपेबल नहीं हूं कि मैं बहुत अच्छा स्पीकर हूं या मैं लोगों को जैसे प्रीचर करते हैं ना बता सके, नहीं। पर मैं अपने लेवल पे कोशिश करूंगा कि जो एविडेंस और जो बिब्लिकल चीज़ें हैं आप तक पहुँचे और थोड़ा सा आपका कुल मिला के आपको एक नई चीज़ सीखने भी मिले और नई चीज़ देखने भी मिले मेरे रिएक्शन के द्वारा। सो थैंक यू।